If you are interested in sports broadcasting, there are 3 books you need to read today.
Welcome to the Sportscasters Club radio show, where it's all about becoming a better sportscaster and a better sports fan. And now, your host, a man who began his sportscasting career by sleeping on hotel floors during road trips, Rick Schultz.
I know it's a lot to say you need to read these 3 books today, and I don't really expect you to have them all read by today, but I want to put these 3 books on your radar. I often get asked, where can I learn more about sports broadcasting? And that's going to tie in to today's question. But these 3 books are 3 books that every sportscaster should read regardless of the level of your career. And these are the 3 books that I have used for my classes, whether it was at Marist College, whether it was at the Connecticut School of Broadcasting, and then when I taught at Fordham University and also as the sports director at WFUV Radio at Fordham. These are 3 books that I have always recommended. It started out as 2, but just in the past year and a half, I added a 3rd book that is so important, and I'm going to talk about all 3 of these books. But before I do, if you are considering a career in sports broadcasting, you may want to check out hosting a podcast of your own, just like I do. And what I use is a company called Buzzsprout, because they make it so simple. It's so easy. You can be pretty much started hosting your own podcast in about 10 minutes. It is that easy to do. Very inexpensive, and Buzzsprout is the host that I use for my podcast. Check it out in the show notes. I'll leave a link in the show notes that you can take a look, because it's a great way to practice. It's a great way to get better. I enjoy doing the podcast. It's a lot of fun. It's a great way to talk to you, and you may want to consider the same thing. So if you check out the show notes, click on that link, and if you do sign up for Buzzsprout to host a podcast, you'll get a free Amazon gift card as well. So it's a great chance to get a little goodie, do a little online shopping at Amazon when you try out Buzzsprout. So if you're considering a podcast, take a look at that. I will leave the link in the show notes. Today's program, talking about the 3 books that every sports broadcasting professional needs to read, whether you're a beginner, whether you're advanced, or maybe you're just a sports fan and you want to know a little bit more about the industry. We're going to get to those 3 books when we come back.
Is this the year you want to learn all you can about a sports broadcasting career? Visit our website, sportscastersclub.com, for articles, tips, advice, and a ton of free resources.
All right, welcome back to the Sportscasters Club online radio show. Rick Schultz with you. When I taught my first sports broadcasting class more than 10 years ago at Marist College, I had to find a textbook. That was one of the requirements. What is your textbook? And it was easy to come up with one of them and a little bit more difficult to come up with the other. And then since then, I've added a 3rd book that I recommend for sports broadcasters. So let's start with the books that I've used since day one, and I'll go through the order in which I use them when I teach in-person classes, whether it was at Marist, Fordham, Connecticut School of Broadcasting. I told students they had to have these books either in physical form or in digital form. Kindle's great, so that's awesome too. First book I pop out here, it's an autographed copy. You can hear me crack open the pages. The first book that I recommend is, boy, what a nice inscription here. To Rick, you're on your way, from Marty Glickman. First book I have always recommended to my sports broadcasting students, The Fastest Kid on the Block, the Marty Glickman story, co-written with Stan Isaacs. And this book came out, I guess it was about 15, maybe more, 20 years ago. It doesn't feel like that long to me, because I was a student of Marty Glickman's at Fordham University when that book was published. Feels like yesterday, but now it is quite a while. 1996, so I was in my 2nd year at Fordham University, and Marty Glickman published this book, The Fastest Kid on the Block. It is the great starter book for sports broadcasters because, number one, it starts out with Marty's life. And anyone who knows Marty Glickman knows that he's a pioneer in the sports broadcasting industry. He is somebody that built a lot of the terminology, the description, the format for radio play-by-play. And so when you hear people like Mike Breen and Bob Costas and Marv Albert, and the list goes on and on and on, Bob Papa, Michael Kay, and the names last forever. Chris Carino, Tony Reale, Connell McShane, Spiro Ditas, Andrew Bogish. When you start naming all these names, the tree all began with Marty Glickman. And Marty was the first true radio play-by-play man who invented a lot of the terminology for basketball. Things like the key, things like swish, the geography, right baseline, right elbow, right wing, passes up top, dribbles between the circles, to the left baseline. All that descriptive terminology, Marty invented. He was a pioneer in the industry, broadcasting mainly in New York City, but it stretched throughout college basketball, and this was when college basketball and the NBA were first blossoming. Marty was there, passed it down to Marv Albert, passed it down to Mike Breen, etc., etc. So The Fastest Kid on the Block talks about Marty's life, how he was at one time the fastest white person on the planet. He was a member of the 1936 Olympic team, but he didn't get to run in Berlin, Germany, because Hitler was in power, and he was pulled right before he was supposed to run in that race. And it's a great history lesson to read and to learn about Marty and Sam Stoller, pulled from racing in that Olympic Games, even though they were, as 18, I think he was 18 at the time. They were certainly deserving, they were qualified, and they were the top people on that team. And the book talks about Jesse Owens and how he was a teammate of Marty's and how they got along, and some of the great things Jesse did to stand up for Marty and to say, no, Marty should be racing in this Olympic Games. But great history lesson. And then it moves on to talk about how he progressed in his life and in his career from being an athlete to then turning into a broadcaster. He went to Syracuse University, started doing some work there, and then it blossomed and grew until he became the broadcast pioneer and ultimately the teacher that he turned into. What a great guy, someone who would always share his insight. He'd call you on a Saturday and invite you down to his apartment in New York City to critique your tapes. That was the kind of guy Marty was. And at Fordham, that's the reason I went to Fordham University, along with WFUV Radio. And Marty would sit with us every week and critique our tapes and tell us the good, bad, and the ugly and how we can get better. And that was really the price of admission. That was well worth it for me. I remember going to a big dinner where Marty was getting an award at the Downtown Athletic Club in New York City, probably right around the time that he published this book. And we walked in, and there were all kinds of big timers in this room. Marv Albert, John Andres, all kinds of executives and professionals from not only media, but the NBA and other areas of the sports world. And I walked in with Connell McShane, Tony Reale, Spiro Ditas, Mike Maffei, Charles Costello, some of the other guys at WFUV with me at the time, Mark Savage. And we walked in, and Marty stopped what he was doing and made a beeline right over to us and asked us, how was your game today? How was the play-by-play? How did you set the scene? How did the broadcast go? That was the kind of guy Marty was. He turned and came right to us because we were his focus. That's the way he always made you feel. And you're going to get a lot of that from this book by Marty Glickman. The second half of this book, it talks a lot about his broadcast philosophy, what your job is as a play-by-play broadcaster, what you're supposed to be accomplishing, how you go about painting that word picture for your listener, what your real task is and your role is, whether you're doing play-by-play, color commentary, reporting. So it's really a great philosophical book about sports broadcasting. And then Marty finishes this book up first by talking about some of the big names that you know in media and basically giving his 2 cents on them. So it's really a lot of fun to read. He has some interesting thoughts about people like Howard Cosell. He's got interesting thoughts about, I'm just opening the book right now, Tim McCarver, Sean McDonough, Dick Enberg, Keith Jackson, John Madden, Larry Merchant. I'm just kind of scanning through. Al Michaels, Brent Musburger, Pat Summerall, Hannah Storm, Phil Simms, Vin Scully, Dick Vitale. So he gives you his take on them as sportscasters. And he also gives advice for new aspiring sports broadcasters. Here's what you should do to build a career. So what a fantastic book, The Fastest Kid on the Block. That's the first book I always start out with my sportscasting students. That's if it's a class I'm teaching in person in a college semester, that's the first book they read over the first few weeks, and we discuss and we go from there because that gets us all on the same page. So book number 1, The Fastest Kid on the Block, the Marty Glickman story. And again, the links to all these books will be in the show notes. So simply scroll down to the show notes of this podcast, click on the link, and it'll take you right to the page for Amazon where you can learn more about it. When we come back, I will give you book number 2.
Is there one person in your life who would love this online radio show? Do you know someone who wants to get into sports broadcasting, or someone who is a huge sports fan and just can't get enough? You just might make their day by sharing this podcast. So share the Sportscasters Club online radio show with your friends and family today.
All right, the Sportscasters Club online radio show rolls on. I'm Rick Schultz. Thank you so much for joining us today as we go through the 3 books all sports broadcasters need to read. Book number 1 we just touched on. It was The Fastest Kid on the Block, the Marty Glickman story. Book number 2. Now, when I found this book 10, 15 years ago when I first started teaching at the college level, it was because I had the Marty Glickman book, and that was great to build the philosophy and the history behind sportscasting. But where could I go to find kind of a nuts and bolts textbook type rundown for sportscasting? And so I searched far and wide, a lot of great options out there, but the one that I found that I think fit exactly what I was looking for is called Call of the Game by Gary Bender. Call of the Game by Gary Bender. And again, the link to this book is in the show notes here on this podcast. So just scroll down to the show notes and you'll find it. This book, as opposed to the Marty Glickman book, which was more philosophical and overarching, the macro view, this is a micro view. And this book goes into the real nuts and bolts, the details, how to prepare for play-by-play, how to deliver a play-by-play broadcast, how to wrap up the post-game show, it's really a how-to manual. This book, Call of the Game by Gary Bender, published in 1994. I'll tell you what some of the parts are. Part 1, choosing a career in sportscasting. Part 2, before entering the booth, where he goes into preparation. Part 3 is working in the booth, where he talks about a typical broadcast, working with the analyst, working with the crew, radio versus TV. Part 4 is developing a play-by-play philosophy. And in my classes, we spend a lot of time in this section talking about the role of a play-by-play announcer, handling controversy, broadcasting ethics. And then Part 5, specializing in play-by-play, developing your skills, career considerations, establishing a play-by-play identity. So really an outstanding nuts and bolts account of how to be a broadcaster. I particularly like the sections, and we spend a lot of time in my classes talking about the sections of how to prepare for a game, because he talks about how to prepare on your own a week before the game, what to do when you show up to the stadium or the arena, how to prepare 2 hours before the game, an hour before the game, what to do right before you go on the air. And some of these things obviously have changed a little bit in the past 25 years with technology, but the basics still hold true. And he really breaks it down. I mean, he even tells you things you should do 5 minutes before the game, and then what to do during the contest and after. So really a great nuts and bolts recap of how to be a broadcaster, how to work with others in the industry, with a color analyst, with directors, producers, reporters. Really comprehensive. And then the other section, as I mentioned, that we talk about a lot and really spend a lot of time is when he gets into handling controversy and broadcasting ethics. In my classes, whether they be at Marist or Fordham or online, we spend a lot of time getting into those issues because they're important for broadcasters to know. So we talked about the Marty Glickman book, Fastest Kid on the Block. That was more overarching and philosophical, the macro view. This book by Gary Bender, Call of the Game, is the micro view, the nuts and bolts, the how-to. It's a textbook for sportscasters, just a fantastic book that you can reference and rely on and go back to. So that's book number 1 and book number 2. When we come back, I'll tell you book number 3, which was a recent edition in the past year and a half, 2 years, and what an edition it has been.
When you're done with this episode, or even if you want to open your browser now, you can go deeper and learn the secrets of sports broadcasting. Search our full list of books at sportscastersclub.com, available from Amazon and Kindle, paperback, and Audible format.
The Sportscasters Club online radio show. Today we're talking about the 3 books that every sports broadcaster should read, and I would expand that to say every serious sports fan as well. And again, the links to these books are in the show notes here of the podcast. So simply scroll down and click, and it'll take you right to the page on Amazon for those books. This third book that I introduced a couple years ago is called Press Box Revolution by Rich Catino. Rich Catino, a proud Fordham WFUV graduate who's gone on to really establish a great career in the New York City market, covering all the local teams, working for WFAN, ESPN Radio New York, covering the Mets. Over his career, he's covered every sport. As a beat reporter, nobody does it better than Rich. And in this book, Press Box Revolution, he really pulls back the curtain, and he talks about his days at WFAN when FAN was starting. And I actually knew Rich a little bit back then because I interned at WFAN Radio in New York in 1998. The spring of 98, before I graduated from Fordham, and Rich Catino was a beat reporter at WFAN, and so I remember him in the bullpen, as they called it, which was basically the newsroom at WFAN with the little cubicles where you'd have the update guy. So maybe Bob Usler was preparing his updates. Rich Catino was there maybe after a game where he was the beat reporter, and my job as an intern was to take in audio tape from either Ed Coleman, Susan Waldman, when they would send it in remotely. And then I would also, as an intern, I would cut up tape from other games. So it might be the radio cast of the Knicks game or the Devils hockey game or the Mets or whatever it was, and cut highlights that John Minko, Bob Usler, the different update anchors could use in their sportscasts. So Rich Catino was someone who was there, and the first thing I always remembered about Rich was he was always willing to help and share his insight. I mean, he didn't know me. I was 20 years old. I was a senior at Fordham. I don't even know if he knew I was from Fordham. He probably did. We probably talked a little bit about that, but he was somebody who was always willing to help, and there's nobody that's carried that further in really the tradition of WFUV and Fordham than Rich. Got to know him a little bit better when I was the sports director at Fordham, and he came in, as he's done for years, to talk with the students and work with the students. But when he published this book 2 years ago, Press Box Revolution by Rich Catino, the subhead is How Sports Reporting Has Changed Over the Past 30 Years. There's a picture of Giannis Cespedes on the cover, and Rich talks about the real world of sports reporting, about being a beat reporter. Let's look at some of the chapters in this book. The Making of a Sports Reporter, WFUV and Sports Phone. Chapter 3, Electronic Media Enters the World of Sports Reporting. Chapter 4, Are Beat Reporters Becoming Obsolete? Then in Chapter 5, he gets in-depth on the 1986 Mets, who he covered, And he really tells some stories in there that I never knew, some behind the scenes things, which are really, really cool. Chapter 6, the demise of network radio. Chapter 7, sports talk radio takes over the airwaves. He talks about WFAN and its inception. Chapter 8, pre and post game shows take center stage. Talks a lot about that. Chapter 9 is play-by-play announcing becoming a lost art. And he really gets to the heart of what a play-by-play broadcaster does and how that's changing with technology. And then he also talks about media relations, talks about the drug culture in Chapter 11 and tells some secrets there. Talks about 1994, a year to remember, great year in New York. And then on and on and on, 25 great chapters. Chapter 24, a game plan for aspiring journalists. That's really cool. Chapter 23, my favorite athletes to interview. And he tells you which ones were awesome to work with, which weren't. But this book is kind of a combination of the Marty book and the Gary Bender book. He tells a lot of real stories, not only from his youth, but from being in clubhouses and being in locker rooms and things that happened. Specifics with women breaking into the industry and being in locker rooms, things he saw, things he heard, things he saw related to race on elevators, and how reporters would talk about minority ball players and things like that. So Rich really pulls back the curtain, and this book is a great book if you want to know what it's really like. And I strongly urge you to check out the show notes of this podcast to find the link and learn more about this book by Rich Catino, Press Box Revolution. That's the third book that I do recommend for all my sportscasting students. So 1, 2, 3, we talked about Marty Glickman, the fastest kid on the block. Number 2, Call of the Game by Gary Bender. And number 3, Press Box Revolution by Rich Catino. Hey, guess what? When we come back, I've got a bonus for you, a book number 4.
If you're enjoying the show, check out our 7-hour online sports broadcasting course. We cover play-by-play, talk show hosting, television, and much more. Visit sportscastersclub.com and click on Online Sportscasting Class.
All right, welcome back to the Sportscasters Club online radio show. Book number 4 that we will touch on today. It's a bonus. We talked about the first 3. This is the 4th book that I'm going to give you to read if you are interested in pursuing a career in sports broadcasting. And it has nothing to do with sports, has nothing to do with broadcasting. The book is by one of my favorite authors, an author named Andy Andrews. He's just a great speaker, lecturer, author. His books are fantastic. Some of his other books are The Noticer Returns. But this book is called The Traveler's Gift, 7 Decisions That Determine Personal Success. And this book by Andy Andrews is a classic. It was a New York Times bestseller. Just a fantastic story about how to build a career, how to build a life. Just reading some of the reviews. The Traveler's Gift touched me in a way that no other book ever has. That was by Barbara Johnson. John Maxwell says Andy Andrews will challenge you to reach your fullest potential. This book really is about mindset, and it's a book that a lot of college and professional sports organizations and teams have read and have worked with Andy. So he would go in and talk with, let's say, a college football team, and they would all get the book to read, and they'd be able to talk about it and figure out some things they could pull out to make them a better team, a better family, a better organization. And just a lot of fun, this book, The Traveler's Gift, because 7 Decisions That Determine Personal Success. This book really has direct correlation regardless of what industry you're in. But definitely and specifically here on this radio show, we talk about sportscasting and some of the challenges you face. And if you read this book, you will find things in here that you can identify with immediately. Things that are going to help you pursue your career in sportscasting. And it's a tale, it's a fable, it's a story that you can read, because that's how I think we take in the best lessons in life, is by hearing stories as opposed to just fact after fact after fact. This book is a story that reads and keeps you engaged. and it's a tale that will give you these lessons without boring you. And Andy Andrews is awesome. So the bonus, The Traveler's Gift by Andy Andrews. And again, scroll down to the show notes to take a look at the links for all 4 of these books. And you can take a look at them immediately by just clicking on the links in our show notes here on the podcast. When we return, it is the part of the program that everybody looks forward to, and you know what that is.
Now it's time for the best part of our show, your questions, our answers. To ask a question for the program, send an email to questions@sportscastersclub.com.
Okay, today's question and answer. We have a question that came in, and again, as you heard, if you'd like to ask a question on the podcast, you can send it to questions@sportscastersclub.com. Today is from Dory in Phoenix, Arizona. And Dory says, where can I learn about the sports broadcasting business? And that's, I kind of placed that question in with this show because we talked about these 3 books that will help you along your sportscasting journey. And this question, I think, ties into that. Dory wanting to learn more about the sports broadcasting business. I could easily say, check out some of the books that we just mentioned, as well as the books that we have published at sportscastersclub.com. But I'm going to give you something else a little bit out of the box because you mentioned learning about the sports broadcasting industry. And if you want to know about sports media and the sports media industry, since you're already listening to this podcast, I would suggest subscribing to the Barrett Sports Media radio show, the Barrett Sports Media podcast. You can find it on the web. You can certainly search wherever you listen to podcasts and download. They have a ton of information. There's not a more comprehensive place to listen to sports radio industry news, sports media news, and someone who's connected like the Barrett Sports Media podcast and the website. They just had their yearly summit in New York City, and I wasn't there. I had a scheduling conflict, wasn't able to get down there. But if you look at the website and look at YouTube, Facebook, you'll see so many of the videos, and what a fantastic program Barrett Sports Media just put forth in New York City. They do it every year. So that would be my answer to you, Dory. A quick, easy answer. If you want the best as far as learning about the sports broadcasting industry, check out the Barrett Sports Media podcast. That will link you to a lot of their material and a lot of the information up to date, the cutting trends in the industry, on the cutting edge. I think I sent out a tweet last week saying that Barrett Sports Media is on the cutting edge as usual. And that's really true. Great place to learn. And who knows, maybe somewhere down the road I get Jason Barrett on this podcast to talk about it. So that would be someplace you can go to learn. So Dory, good luck with that. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And send us a message, send us a note. Let me know what you think of that podcast as well, because it's really a fantastic one. And I listen to a lot of podcasts, and the Barrett Sports Media podcast is right on the top of my list when I open up my Apple player, my podcast player. So Dory, good luck with that. You'll find a lot of value with that podcast. So what a great show we've had today. We talked about our 3 books plus our bonus book. And when we come back, we're going to wrap it up.
Are you enjoying the Sportscasters Club online radio show? If so, please hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss an episode. When we release each new show, you'll be the first to know. So hit the subscribe button in your podcast app today, and we'll keep the awesome, cool, entertaining, and informative material coming.
The Sportscasters Club online radio show, winding down another exciting episode. Just to recap what we talked about today, and again, you can scroll down to the show notes and find the links for these books. We talked about the 3 books that every sportscaster and aspiring sportscaster should read today. Number 1, The Fastest Kid on the Block by Marty Glickman. Number 2, Call of the Game by Gary Bender. And number 3, Press Box Revolution by Rich Catino. 3 awesome books. My advice would be scroll down to the show notes, click on it, and order them today, whether it be digitally on Kindle or the physical book right there by Amazon. You will not regret it. Also, I gave you a bonus book that's going to help your career and your outlook as you plan your career, and honestly, whether it's in sportscasting or not. And that book is The Traveler's Gift by Andy Andrews. I first read this book maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, and I just love Andy Andrews' material. A fun book, great before bed reading to put some positivity in your mind, to give you some good thoughts, and we all need that. What you fill your mind with right before bed is so important. So I always try to finish up with a book, a real book, a physical book. Number one, I don't get all those, the blue light and all those things that disrupt your sleep. But I like to fill myself with a little positivity before I go to bed, because it's so easy to get negative in this world, and staying positive is the key to so many things. So check out those 3 books. Check out The Traveler's Gift, our bonus book. And we hope you enjoyed this episode. It was a lot of fun for me. Hopefully we'll do this again down the road, and I'll share some of the other resources that I recommend to students and to aspiring sportscasters. But we thank you for subscribing. If you know one other sportscaster that can benefit from this podcast and this radio show, thank you for sharing this with them to allow them to build their career and enjoy it. Hopefully it's for sportscasters and for sports fans alike. I'm Rick Schultz, and we will catch you next time on the Sportscasters Club online radio show.
Thanks for listening to the Sportscasters Club radio show at sportscastersclub.com. Don't forget to subscribe so you will never miss an episode. And thanks for liking, sharing, posting reviews, and spreading the word.